Right now, in the early hours of a Thursday morning, the lights in the Situation Room at the White House are on. They have been on since 3 a.m. The reason is a pair of simultaneous signals that arrived within 40 minutes of each other, and the combination of those two signals is what has senior national security officials in Washington describing this as, quietly, the most consequential development in Iran policy in over a decade. The first signal came from the International Atomic Energy Agency's remote monitoring system at Fordo, the hardened underground enrichment facility buried inside a mountain near Qom. The IAEA's sensors registered a cascade output consistent with uranium enriched to 90%, weapons grade, sustained over a period of at least 6 hours. Not a spike, not a test pulse. 6 sustained hours. That is not an accident. That is a declaration. The second signal came through back-channel diplomatic communications routed through Oman's foreign ministry in Muscat, a channel that both the United States and Iran have used for sensitive communications since at least 2013. The message, according to officials briefed on its contents, offered a 60-day freeze on all enrichment activity above 60%, in exchange for the immediate suspension of the secondary sanctions package imposed in March, a reopening of frozen Iranian assets held in South Korean and Japanese financial institutions totaling approximately $11 billion, and the beginning of direct, unconditional talks between Iranian and American negotiators. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. This is not Iran making a desperate plea. This is Iran presenting Washington with a carefully engineered binary. Acknowledge the nuclear fait accompli and negotiate, or watch the 60-day window close and the enrichment continue. The framing is not a request, it is a deadline. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Iran reached this precise moment without triggering a preemptive response, what the enrichment breakthrough actually means for the physics of a potential weapon and the timeline it creates, and how the decision made in Washington in the next 72 hours will directly determine the price of oil, food, and shipping costs for every household in every major economy on Earth. Stay with me. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to November 29th, 2021. That was the day the 7th round of talks in Vienna to restore the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, began with a new Iranian delegation that had never participated in negotiations before. The delegation arrived with a maximalist position that European diplomats described privately as designed to fail. Iran demanded the removal of all sanctions before a single nuclear concession. Western parties refused. The talks dragged into 2022, producing draft text, then counter-drafts, then a near agreement in August 2022 that collapsed within 2 weeks when Iran introduced a new demand, a guarantee that no future American administration could unilaterally exit the deal, as the Trump administration had done in May 2018. That demand was, legally and constitutionally, one that no American president could provide. The talks formally stalled, and as they stalled, Iran's nuclear program did not. Between November 2021 and January 2023, Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, sub-weapons grade, but one technical step below it, grew from roughly 10 kilograms to over 200 kilograms. The IAEA, in its February 2023 report, described this as a significant development. That language was diplomatically understated. 200 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium can, through a relatively short additional enrichment process, produce sufficient fissile material for multiple nuclear devices. In January 2024, the Biden administration imposed a new tranche of secondary sanctions targeting Iranian petrochemical exports and the network of front companies facilitating Iranian oil sales in Asia. Iran responded not with a diplomatic protest, but with an acceleration in centrifuge deployment at Natanz. By mid-2024, Iran had installed IR-6 centrifuges, machines that enrich uranium approximately 10 times faster than the first-generation IR-1 centrifuges permitted under the original JCPOA, in configurations that the IAEA said it could no longer fully monitor because Iran had removed monitoring cameras at multiple sites in February 2021. Let me put this in concrete terms. The monitoring architecture that gave the world early warning of Iranian nuclear advances has been, since early 2021, significantly degraded. The IAEA has been working partly blind. In April 2024, in response to Israeli airstrikes on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Iran launched its first-ever direct ballistic missile and drone attack against Israeli territory. Over 300 projectiles, mostly intercepted, but a threshold crossed that altered the strategic calculus of every actor in the region. The psychological shift was significant. Iran demonstrated both the will and the capability to strike across distances previously considered deterrent boundaries. Through the remainder of 2024 and into early 2025, the diplomatic channel through Oman continued to carry low-level messages. Neither side fully broke contact, but no substantive progress occurred. Meanwhile, the enrichment continued. The stockpile grew. The technical timeline shortened. What happened this week did not come out of nowhere. It came out of 3.5 years of a deliberate, patient, incremental strategy by Tehran to build irreversible leverage before returning to the table. The move that Washington is now responding to was not improvised. It was prepared. Let us now examine what the 6-hour enrichment event at Fordow actually means, and why it is different from everything that came before it. Fordow is not a site that Iran chose arbitrarily. It was constructed specifically to be resistant to military strikes. The facility sits approximately 80 to 100 meters underground, the deepest of Iran's known nuclear sites, inside a granite mountain near the city of Qom. The American GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the largest bunker-busting bomb in the U.S. arsenal, is assessed by the Defense Intelligence Agency to be capable of penetrating approximately 60 meters of reinforced concrete or 40 meters of rock. That leaves a meaningful uncertainty margin against Fordow. The Israelis do not possess the GBU-57 at all. This geography matters because it means Iran chose Fordow specifically for this demonstration. They were not using their most exposed facility. They were using the one that is hardest to destroy. Now, the enrichment itself, the difference between 60% and 90% enriched uranium is not simply a number. It is the difference between material that requires a measurable additional processing period and material that is, in physics terms, weapons usable. The IAEA defines 90% enrichment as highly enriched uranium, HEU, and it is the benchmark for direct use material in a nuclear device. Iran's crossing of this threshold is unprecedented in the country's known nuclear history. Here is something that no non-proliferation analyst had seen before in the context of active diplomacy. A state simultaneously offering to negotiate while demonstrating the capability it is offering to freeze. That is an entirely new diplomatic posture. What military strategists are actually saying, and this has come through in briefings to congressional committees over the past 72 hours, is that the 6-hour event changes the so-called breakout timeline in fundamental ways. Breakout time is the estimated period from a decision to weaponize to sufficient fissile material for one device. In 2015, under the JCPOA, that timeline was assessed at approximately 12 months. By 2022, it had collapsed to roughly 3 months. Based on the Fordow event and current stockpile estimates, Iran holds approximately 42 kilograms of 60% enriched material and has now demonstrated 90% capability. Some officials are describing the timeline as measured in days to weeks, not months, for sufficient material. The weapon design, the delivery system, the assembly, those steps would take longer. But the fissile material threshold is now effectively crossed in capability terms. The second military dimension is the deployment of 3 Iranian Kilo-class submarines and a surface escort group into the northern approaches of the Strait of Hormuz within the past 36 hours. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil transit it every single day, roughly 20% of global supply. The submarines are Soviet-era, but have undergone significant Iranian upgrades and are armed with wake-homing torpedoes and anti-ship cruise missiles with ranges of up to 300 kilometers. Their positioning is not operationally threatening in an immediate sense. They have not interfered with traffic. Their positioning is signaling. It says, we have options below the threshold of war that we have not exercised yet. The combination of the Fordow enrichment event and the naval repositioning is what analysts are calling a dual-key signal. Neither action alone crosses a red line. Together, they communicate a single message to Washington. The cost of inaction is now higher than the cost of negotiation. That threshold has now been crossed. The market opened on the morning of the Fordow announcement with Brent crude at $79 per barrel. Within 3 hours, it was trading at $94 per barrel. That is a 19% move in a single session, the largest single-session energy price shock since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, when prices spiked from $78 to $105 in under a week. As of the time of this recording, Brent is consolidating at approximately $91 per barrel, but options markets are pricing in significant probability of $110 or above within 30 days. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from an enrichment event in an underground facility near Qom, Iran, to the price of heating oil, gasoline, and aviation fuel in your city. Let me put this in concrete terms by walking through the transmission mechanism. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most critical energy choke point on Earth. 21 million barrels per day. That includes not just crude oil, but also approximately 2 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas, primarily from Qatar, every single day. The countries that depend most directly on that flow are Japan, South Korea, India, and China. Their reserve positions are what determine how quickly a disruption becomes a crisis. Japan currently holds approximately 254 days of oil reserves, the most robust buffer among the major importers, built deliberately after the 1973 oil shock. South Korea holds approximately 107 days. India holds between 20 and 25 days of strategic reserves, a figure that has not materially improved in a decade despite repeated government commitments to do so. China's strategic petroleum reserve is estimated at between 90 and 100 days, though the opacity of Chinese data makes precise assessment difficult. The gap between India's 20-day buffer and Japan's 254-day buffer is the difference between a pricing disruption and a genuine supply emergency. For India specifically, a sustained Hormuz disruption or significant price spike ripples immediately into food prices. India imports approximately 85% of its crude oil needs. Its fertilizer sector, which uses natural gas as the primary feedstock for urea, the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer in Indian agriculture, is acutely sensitive to energy price movements. A 30% increase in crude and gas prices translates within 2 to 3 crop cycles into higher urea costs, higher food production costs, and ultimately higher prices at markets in Mumbai, Delhi, Karachi, and Dhaka. That timeline is measured in months, not years. Shipping costs are already moving. The Baltic Dry Index, a benchmark for bulk shipping rates, rose 4% in a single session, the index's fastest single-day move in 8 months. Shipping insurers activated war risk premium clauses for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf and Northern Arabian Sea. That premium, currently running at approximately 15% of cargo value per voyage for the Gulf region, historically spikes to 5% or above during active crisis periods. For a liquefied natural gas tanker carrying $60 million in cargo, that is the difference between $90,000 and $300,000 in insurance costs per voyage. Those costs get passed through to utilities, to manufacturers, to consumers. The downstream industries most exposed over the next 30 to 60 days are aviation, jet fuel is already up 18%, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and any consumer goods manufactured using petrochemical inputs. That includes plastics, pharmaceuticals, synthetic textiles, and a significant portion of packaged food. The supply chain integration of energy costs into everyday goods is something that the 2021 and 2022 inflation wave made viscerally clear to consumers in every major economy, and the mechanism this time is structurally identical. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. This channel covers the transmission mechanisms that the headlines routinely skip over. And here's the thing, the headlines aren't telling you. The oil price move may not be the most consequential economic signal this week. The more important move is in the gold market, where prices crossed $3,200 per troy ounce for the first time, a flight to safety trade that reflects not just energy uncertainty, but genuine concern among institutional investors that the diplomatic resolution window is shorter than governments are publicly acknowledging. The first official American response came through the National Security Council, which issued a terse statement acknowledging the IAEA's monitoring reports and calling on Iran to refrain from further provocative nuclear activities. That statement is, diplomatically, a holding pattern. It commits to nothing and forecloses nothing. The real conversations are happening in 3 other places simultaneously. In Muscat, the Omani foreign minister has been on the phone continuously. Oman has played this role before, as it was the back channel through which the Obama administration conducted preliminary JCPOA talks in 2013, and it was the channel through which the Biden administration sent messages during the 2022 NEAR agreement. Oman's leverage is its unique position as a Gulf state that maintains functional diplomatic relations with both Tehran and Washington, while being a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council. What Oman needs domestically is stability. Its economy is heavily dependent on regional trade and transit, and any sustained Gulf crisis directly threatens Omani commercial interests. That gives Muscat a genuine incentive to facilitate, not simply to appear to facilitate. In Beijing, Chinese foreign ministry officials are engaged in what one European diplomat described as unusually active contacts with their Iranian counterparts. China is Iran's largest oil customer, purchasing approximately 5 million barrels per day at prices discounted from global benchmarks, an arrangement made possible precisely by the sanctions framework that Iran is demanding be dismantled. China's public position will be support for dialogue and opposition to sanctions. China's private incentive is more nuanced. It benefits from cheap, discounted Iranian oil, but it does not benefit from a regional conflict that disrupts Gulf shipping lanes, on which it also depends heavily for Saudi, UAE, and Kuwaiti imports. In Riyadh, the calculation is different again. Saudi Arabia's public red line has always been that it will not accept a nuclear-armed Iran. That position has not changed. But the Abraham Accords era, and, more significantly, the March 2023 China-brokered Saudi-Iranian Normalization Agreement, have introduced a complicating layer. Riyadh cannot credibly call for military action against Tehran while simultaneously operating a diplomatic normalization framework with it. Saudi Arabia's private preference, shared by the UAE, is likely a negotiated freeze that removes the near-term weapons risk without producing a comprehensive deal that might legitimize Iranian influence in the region. Turkey is the unexpected mediator worth watching. Ankara has maintained intelligence and diplomatic channels with Tehran throughout periods when Western engagement was frozen. Turkish President Erdogan has offered in public statements over the past 24 hours to facilitate dialogue between all parties. That offer is not altruistic. Turkey's energy import bill is directly affected by regional instability, and Erdogan's government benefits domestically from projecting Turkey as an indispensable diplomatic actor. But the offer is genuine and the channel is functional. The gap between public positions and private incentives is, as always, where the diplomacy actually happens. Iran's public position is that it has a sovereign right to nuclear technology and will not negotiate under threat. Iran's private incentive is sanctions relief and asset unfreezing, which the Oman message makes explicit. Washington's public position is that it will not reward escalation. Washington's private incentive is to avoid a military confrontation in an election cycle while managing a two-front strategic competition with China. Those private incentives are not incompatible. The 60-day window Tehran has offered is, structurally, enough time to produce a framework agreement if the political will exists. There are three distinct trajectories from this point, and each one carries a specific set of consequences. The first scenario is a negotiated resolution within the 60-day window. This requires the United States to accept a partial suspension of secondary sanctions, not their full removal, but a temporary waiver on the petrochemical and oil export sanctions as a show of good faith within the first 2 weeks. Iran, in parallel, would need to provide IAEA inspectors with access to Fordow within 72 hours to verify a halt in 90% enrichment. The technical mechanism for this exists. It was used in the interim JCPOA of November 2013. What makes it difficult is domestic politics in both capitals. In Tehran, the hardline Revolutionary Guard factions have openly opposed any agreement that does not include full sanctions removal first. In Washington, congressional opposition, particularly from senators who view any engagement with Tehran as rewarding nuclear blackmail, makes even a temporary sanctions waiver politically costly. This scenario is possible. It is not easy. It requires both governments to absorb significant domestic criticism in the service of a framework that neither side can fully trust. The second scenario is continued attrition. The 60-day window closes without agreement, enrichment resumes, and both sides escalate incrementally without crossing into open conflict. In this scenario, the economic costs accumulate in a measurable week-by-week pattern. Each week of sustained elevated oil prices at 90 plus per barrel costs the global economy, by IMF modeling, approximately $12 billion in excess energy expenditure above baseline. The shipping premium continues. The fertilizer cost transmission works through into food prices on a 3 to 6 month lag. Iran's economy, already under severe sanctions pressure with annual inflation running above 40%, continues to deteriorate. But the regime has demonstrated over 4 decades a capacity to sustain economic pain that Western analysts have repeatedly underestimated. This is the scenario that grinds. It does not produce a dramatic event that forces a resolution. It produces a slow accumulation of costs that eventually either breaks the impasse or produces the conditions for catastrophic escalation. The third scenario is catastrophic escalation, and this is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. The trigger for this scenario is not a deliberate decision by any government to go to war. It is an accident, a miscalculation, or a third-party action that forces an escalatory response. The most plausible triggering mechanism, based on current force dispositions, is an incident in the Strait of Hormuz involving the Iranian submarines and a U.S. Navy escort of a commercial vessel. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, has carrier strike groups within operational range. If an Iranian submarine were to shadow or approach a U.S. or allied vessel in a manner that triggered an active defense response, even without weapons being fired, the subsequent chain of events could move faster than diplomatic communication can contain. A second mechanism is an Israeli preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, conducted unilaterally, that forces both Iran and the United States into reactive positions they did not choose. Israel has publicly stated, repeatedly and at the highest levels of government, that it will not permit Iran to achieve nuclear weapons capability. The Fordow event brings that stated red line into direct confrontation with current facts on the ground. In this catastrophic scenario, the first-order military exchange is only the beginning. Iranian proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militia networks in Iraq and Syria, Houthi forces in Yemen, would activate simultaneously. The Strait of Hormuz would close. Oil would price above $140 per barrel within 72 hours. Global equity markets would experience dislocations not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The nuclear architecture that has governed the Middle East since Israel's presumed acquisition of nuclear weapons in the 1960s would be fundamentally, irreversibly altered. The nuclear architecture that existed before the Fordow event is not coming back. That is true regardless of which scenario unfolds. Watch oil, watch gold, watch the straight traffic. Those 3 indicators will tell you, faster than any press release or diplomatic statement, which of those 3 scenarios is materializing. If Brent crude begins to fall back below $85 within the next 10 days, a negotiated framework is likely taking shape. If it holds above $90 with increasing volatility, attrition is the operative scenario. If it crosses $110, something has gone badly wrong. Let me now put the full picture in terms of what it means for your daily life, because this is not abstract geopolitics. This is a direct line from an underground enrichment facility in Iran to the cost of filling your car, heating your home, buying groceries, and paying your electricity bill. Gasoline prices in the United States are calculated from Brent crude, with a roughly 6-week lag for refinery and distribution processing. A $91 Brent price translates to approximately $3.60 per gallon at the pump in the national average. That number rises to roughly $4. $20 per gallon if Brent sustains above $100. Heating oil and natural gas utility bills in Europe, which import significant volumes of LNG from Qatar through the same Hormuz corridor, are already pricing a 10 to 15% winter premium into forward contracts. Airfares are set to rise 3 to 5% within 60 days based on current jet fuel pricing. The price of a shipping container from Shanghai to Los Angeles, a benchmark for the cost of manufactured goods, has increased 14% in spot markets in the past 72 hours. And the fertilizer price index, which determines in large measure the cost of food production globally, is up 8% on natural gas input costs alone. This is the full picture that the headlines are compressing into Iran nuclear tensions and oil prices rise. The actual transmission mechanism runs from a mountain in Iran to the price of bread in Lagos, Istanbul, Jakarta, and your own city. It runs from a Kilo-class submarine in the Strait of Hormuz to the cost of your electric bill next winter. The connections are real, they are quantifiable, and they operate on timelines measured in weeks to months. Zoom out for a moment to the historical weight of what is unfolding. The nuclear non-proliferation architecture, the global system of treaties, inspections, and deterrence norms built painstakingly since 1968, has never faced a challenge quite like this one. Not because Iran is more dangerous than previous nuclear aspirants, but because the combination of demonstrated enrichment capability, a deliberate negotiating offer, and the regional context of the Abraham Accords normalization framework creates a genuinely novel situation. Iran is not acting like a state that has been caught. It is acting like a state that has decided it has enough leverage to dictate terms. Whether that assessment is correct, whether Washington accepts that framing or rejects it, is the decision that will define the next decade of Middle Eastern and global energy security. And here is the open question that no analyst, no official, and no diplomat can currently answer. If a deal is reached in the next 60 days and Iran agrees to freeze its enrichment below weapons grade, what happens on day 61? The technical knowledge does not disappear. The centrifuges do not disappear. The hardened facilities do not disappear. What exactly does a sustainable agreement look like when one party has already demonstrated the capability it is agreeing to limit? That question, about the durability and verifiability of any framework going forward, is one we will examine in depth in the next video. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.